Welcome to One Longfellow Square.
Thank you, Chad.
We're all excited to talk about country music.
Yes.
Bob Wills, yes.
Let's talk about your comics. High and Lois, Beetle Bailey, and The Phantom.
Yeah, Cy Berry.
Wow.
I liked them all, but those were the three that I picked out as being. And High and Lois was because it was my mom and dad's favorite.
Gotcha.
For whatever reason.
That was a lot of people's parents' favorite.
Yeah. there you go. And you know, Beetle Bailey. I might mention Beetle Bailey a little bit later on, but first let's talk about your career in comics. Well, let's start even before then. I read on the internet, so it may or may not be true that you were born in Iowa.
I was. Yeah. My dad taught at Iowa State at the time, and I was born there in 1963, and I lived there for about 6 months. And then we moved to New Hampshire. And I'm nothing against Iowa, but I'm glad to have moved to New Hampshire.
And you also first noticed comics in the newspaper?
Yeah. Well, hard to say. I mean, I don't remember if I first fell in love with Peanuts, seeing it in the paper, or seeing it in the reprint books. But here's what I do remember. When I was at the end of 2nd grade, I already knew about Peanuts then, but my dad, who was a professor, went on sabbatical to Hawaii. And we got to go and live in Hawaii for 6 months. And for the first couple months, we stayed in the house of a colleague of my dad's, and that professor and his family were gone. They had vacated the house, so it was all ours. So my brother and I stayed in the rooms of these kids, and they had the most fantastic collection of Peanuts reprint books. And so I just read them all, and, you know, talk about great value. The books cost, back then, 50 cents a piece. So you could keep yourself in Peanuts. My allowance at the time was $1 a week. So you could buy 2 Peanuts books per week if you didn't waste your money on something else. So, so yeah, I fell in love with comics in general, and Peanuts specifically, probably in like 1st or 2nd grade.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are there any qualities that you could attribute specifically to Peanuts that didn't apply to others? That
Be careful, Chad. I could talk about Peanuts for the entire hour. Well, watch yourself.
Well, we'll get back to that, I'm sure, as well. But
yes, the answer is yes. There were many qualities of Peanuts because, first of all, it didn't look like anything else on the page. The panels were always, in its heyday, the panels, there were always 4 of them. They were always identically sized, and they were always shorter than all the other strips. And Sparky, Charles Schulz, always said that when they were selling Peanuts, starting in 1950, he was pressured to construct it that way because the newspapers and the syndicate wanted the option to be able to stack the strip instead of running it straight across, to stack it 2 boxes on top of 2 others. And he always resented it, but he ended up working in that format and making it look great. And because the format was smaller than all the other strips, he really had to strip down his art. So his art was simpler than anybody else's. It was more elegant. And of course, he wrote like nobody else. His jokes were the best. Even when his jokes were like heartbreakingly sad, they were awesome. And that's one thing that set Peanuts apart, is that, you know, it dealt, you know, in the realm of childhood sadness, you know, and loneliness, and Sparky battled, you know, his own demons and depression for his entire life, and so it made sense that it would come out in the strip. And I identified with what everybody at one point or another has identified with Charlie Brown, who couldn't. So.
Now, you also read the newspaper every day. In your case, it was a different one than I did.
I read 2 newspapers every day, Chad.
And
we got the Boston Globe, and we got the Foster's Daily Democrat in Dover, New Hampshire.
Excellent. And were there other strips in there that caught your attention?
I read them all.
Yeah.
Back then, you know, when I started reading comics, a lot of the old comics from the golden age of comics were on their last legs. So I remember reading Mutt and Jeff, Lil Abner, Pogo. You know, all those strips, great strips, but, you know, they were sort of like at the end.
Right.
I read Fred Bassett. I tried to copy Fred Bassett. that's how you learn to draw when you're become a cartoonist. There were no cartooning classes back then. No one was gathering us kids at Oyster River Elementary School and saying, "Come on, kids, let's draw comics." There wasn't much respect for comics back then. If you went and asked a librarian or a teacher what they thought of comics, they would say that's not real reading. But I knew better.
Yeah. So when did you start drawing? When did you decide I could make comics?
Yeah, so I have a drawing that sometimes I go to schools and I do like school visits and I give a little PowerPoint presentation, and I have a drawing of Charlie Brown that I show in that presentation that I did when I was 6, and I was copying, Charlie Brown is carrying Snoopy's supper dish out to the doghouse, and there's like some erasures, some mistakes, and then it looks like I started at the top. I drew his head, definitely had problems with the shape of his head, and then worked my way down, and then you get down to the bottom of the drawing and he just has no legs. I gave up. But yeah, so that's how you learn, is you copy. And sometimes, if I go, at some event, or I talk at a bookstore and I meet parents, and some parents, they're actually they're kind of anxious about the fact that all their kids do is copy things. Like, all my kid wants to, they just want to draw Spider-Man over and over again. They just want to copy like the wimpy kid or whatever. And I always say, it's developmentally appropriate, and eventually they'll get tired of copying whatever it is they're doing, and they'll make up their own stuff.
At what point did it enter your head that this might be a career that you could aspire to?
I was probably in high school. I mean, I was always identified, probably starting in 5th grade, as the kid who drew comics. But I didn't really put 2 and 2 together that you could make a living at it until I got a little older.
Because that's what I think is really extraordinary. I mean, I made this analogy when we had a conversation last week. You're in 400 papers across the country. There's only 1,300 daily papers in the country, if Wikipedia can be believed. And
Wikipedia.
Anyway, so I mean, given that there's 15, 16, maybe as many as 20 comics in each one, at your level, there's probably fewer than 100 cartoonists currently working. There's more major league pitchers than that. So there's a lot of kids who said, I want to be a major league pitcher when I grow up, and they didn't do it. You've been a cartoonist working for 28 years. It's extraordinary.
Are you telling me it's not too late for my dream of pitching for the Red Sox?
I don't think so. No, I'm telling you.
I'm ready. They need me right now.
I'm telling you, I'm super impressed.
They're killing me.
Yeah. This is a key question I have here. Is where were you in 6th grade?
I was at Oyster River Middle School, Durham, New Hampshire, and I was just a few minutes ago. I was talking to some kids over in our little reception across the street there, and I met a young man named Alex who was in 5th grade at Falmouth. And I said, so next year you'll be in 6th grade, you'll be in middle school. And I explained to him that when I started the strip, I made Big Nate a 6th grader because, for me, 6th grade was when that is a time of seismic change. You go from elementary school where you just you're in like a little bubble. You're in one classroom pretty much all day long. You have one teacher who teaches you all the subjects. And then all of a sudden, and if you're in 5th grade, as Alex is, you're the biggest kid. And then you go into middle school, and now 6, 7, 8, and all of a sudden you got a locker. You've got 6 different classes, 6 different teachers. You have no idea what's going on. There's school dances, there's intramural sports, there are all these things that weren't even part of the equation in elementary school. 6th grade is so much more interesting than 5th grade. So that's where I was. I was in 6th grade. I was looking around me saying, where am I? And trying to, figure it out.
So you survived 6th grade, went on to go to college
I did survive 6th grade, despite the just paralyzing fear that my mother put in me, bless her heart. So at the time, there was, you know, there was all this talk about like kids getting bold in middle school, getting swirly, getting their heads stuck in the toilet, and someone. And my mom was like, "I heard Scott Gahan got bold," and I did not go into the boys' room for like probably until like December of my 6th grade year. I wanted no part of getting bold. But I survived.
Yeah, phew. And continued on. When you chose to go to school in Maine, was that with the idea of comics being the profession, or?
I think about this a lot just because, you know, our 2 kids have gone through college, and a lot of our friends, their kids either have finished or are applying to colleges or whatever, and I always think about how little thought I put into where I went to college. I mean, you know, Colby College, it was great, but like, I went there basically because my brother's best friend was there, and he seemed like a pretty decent guy. And on the day that I visited, did my campus visit, it was sunny. It was nice.
That's a reason, I guess. Yeah. Anyway, you studied art there?
I was an art major. I went in, you know, they always ask you when you apply to college, like, what do you want to study or what do you think you're going to be? And, you know, just to write something down, I wrote chemistry. and then I got there, and I had no art classes scheduled in the first semester, but then I had an English class, a writing class, and I tested out of it. Like the professor said, you don't need this. So now I had like a free slot, so I took an art class, and I liked that. So I just said, well, maybe I'll just do this. So I did.
And was that the place where your comics first got published, printed in a publication?
Yeah, that's the first place I ever did a regularly occurring comic strip in the Colby Echo, our school paper. So I went there. So at the time, one of my heroes, and still, is Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury. And so he had gone to Yale, and he did a comic strip called Bull Tales in the Yale Daily News. And then he got signed as a syndicated cartoonist right out of college and started Doonesbury. And so I thought, you know, maybe I could do that. So to do that, well, what's the first step? Well, I got to do a comic strip for the school paper. So I found the Colby Echo office, basically like my second day on campus. And I said, can I do a comic strip? They said, yeah. So I named it Third Floor. And it was a weekly. The paper came out once a week, if that. And I did it all 4 years.
Wow. Those have yet to be collected anyway, right?
No, I mean, I still have some of the Colby Echo newspapers in my attic. And if I want to go up and really feel embarrassed about my cartooning skills, I can look at those strips that I did there.
On leaving college, you didn't go directly to famous cartoonist existence, correct? You did something else.
I went to grad school.
Oh.
So I had a couple of mentors in the art department at Colby who I really loved. Abbott Meader, anybody know Abbott Meader? The legendary Maine filmmaker and painter. And Harriet Matthews, my drawing instructor. And they both they were great people, and they looked like they had great lives. Like they came into, they had studios in these beautiful places in Maine, and they came to campus a couple days a week, and they taught studio art, and I thought, that could be good. Because at the time, I still wasn't really thinking I'm going to make a living as a cartoonist. It seemed incredibly remote. I had already started trying to, like, submitting stuff to syndicates for syndication in my freshman year of college, and all I had received to that point was just form letters, just rejection letters. So I thought, well, my backup plan will be to go get my master's degree and maybe like teach college art. So I went to Brooklyn College and got my MFA. But here's what happened at Brooklyn College, Chad. So we had these studio spaces that were in what had once been a locker room. And they just subdivided this locker room into all these studio spaces, and they put up these just, you know, like corkboard walls and partitioned us all off. So I had this little space. And periodically, you would invite one of your professors to come in and look at your work and give you a critique. So I had this professor, and I said, oh, will you come look at my work? And so before he came, I put up all these drawings and paintings all over my little space. But in this little corner of the space, I had drawn, right on the wall, I had drawn a little comic, and it was called The Game of Art. It was a board game. And it had all these little cartoons, and the gag was, the joke was, there was no way to win. And so this professor came in, and he looked at all my drawings that I had worked so hard on. He looked at all my paintings that I worked so hard on, and he looked at my comic. And then he pointed to the comic. He said, that's the best thing in here. And so I could have taken it as a sort of a slap, like, guess my paintings aren't so good. But I chose not to look at it that way because I thought the comic was the best thing in there too. And so when I got my master's, I got a teaching job. I taught high school art and coached the baseball team at an all-boys Catholic school in Manhattan called St. Francis Xavier. But while I was doing that, while I was teaching and coaching, I redoubled my efforts to get syndicated. So that's when it started to feel more, because I started getting letters then that weren't just form letters. They would actually give me some feedback, you know, on what I was doing.
And one day, one of them panned out. How was it?
Yeah, I had submitted so many bad ideas. I mean, I did a strip about a guy and his pet rat. I did one about a high school, like, gym teacher. I did one that was set in a zoo, just with talking animals. Just a lot of, like, really bad ideas. But eventually what led to Big Nate was I submitted an idea called Neighborhood Comics. And it was roughly based, in some ways, on my own family unit, you know, 2 parents, an older brother, and then a younger brother, and then some of the neighborhood kids from my neighborhood in New Hampshire. And then I submitted that, and I got back a letter from the woman who eventually became my first editor, and she said that she liked it, so that was great. But she suggested that I pick one character and focus on that character. And so I did, and I chose this character, Nate, which was my nickname for my older brother growing up. So that's how, and then I eventually just changed the name to Big Nate, and they eventually offered me a contract. So.
And how did that process of getting started go? I mean, here, you're in the newspaper, start drawing? Is that how that works? Or?
No. So they sign you to what's called a development deal. And what they do is they pay you an absurdly small stipend to produce a strip as if it's being published every day, but it's not. So you are meeting deadlines, you're submitting your stuff, and at the time, the syndicate was in the Pan Am building in Manhattan, and I lived in Brooklyn, so I could literally just, like, walk my stuff in. So that was an advantage of living in New York at the time. And so I would just take it in, and what they're trying to do is see, is this guy meeting his deadlines? Is his stuff getting better over time? So the development deal lasted, I think, 6 months. And I could see that it was getting better, so that was gratifying. And then at the end of the development deal, they decide whether or not they're going to offer you a syndication contract. And so they offered it to me, and then there's a period during which they launch you internally within the syndicate. They introduce you and your strip to all their sales staff, and then the sales staff goes out and tries to sell it. And that's the way it worked in the late 80s. The model has changed somewhat because syndication is not quite the business it used to be. It works differently now. So syndicates aren't, if you read comics, you'll notice that there aren't very many, if any, new comics anymore that come out. Like, if a newspaper runs a reader poll and they say, oh, we're trying to see if people like this, and should we bring in this strip? But it's rare that they bring in a strip that's entirely new. They'll bring in a strip that has maybe, they've seen that it has success in other papers elsewhere, and then they'll see if they want to add it to their lineup.
So how many papers did you launch in? Do you remember?
I launched in 135.
Okay.
And then I almost immediately lost like almost half of them.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the story might take too long to tell, but I will just, so they wanted to have a big launch. They wanted, it had been a while since they had launched a strip like with maybe more than 80 papers. So they incentivized Big Nate for their sales staff, and they said, you know, we'll pay you a bonus for every sale you make. And so one sales guy in particular was so anxious to get his bonuses that I later found out, and the syndicate later found out, that he manufactured sales.
No.
So at the time, you would get in the mail, you would get a sales slip every time they sold you into a paper. So this guy was the West Coast rep, and every day I'm getting envelopes saying, Elmer just sold you into, you know, the San Francisco Chronicle. Elmer just sold you into the Sacramento Bee. And I was beside myself. I'm like, this is great. And then Big Nate debuted on like January 6th or 7th of 1991, and this sales guy died the next day. And then all those sales just dried up. Some of them dried up because they were real sales, but no one was there to follow them up. And others dried up because they weren't real sales to begin with. And the syndicate found out that Elmer had been just basically trying to run a scam where he got bonuses. So I immediately went from the most successful launch they had had in many years to, can this strip survive, you know?
So how long was it after launch that the Washington Post picked you up? Because that
They picked me up like a month, about a month later. I was just talking about this earlier tonight. I got picked up by the Washington Post, and whenever a newspaper adds a strip, they usually have to drop a strip to make room. So they brought in Big Nate and they dumped Mark Trail. The Mark Trail fans, I mean, break out the torches and pitchforks, man. They were going crazy. They wanted their Mark Trail back.
Wow.
And they wrote many, many angry letters. I still have a letter where, even though, and at the same time, they sort of reorganized their comics page and they moved Doonesbury off of the comics page and sort of onto the editorial page. And someone wrote in a letter, even though it's not like Big Nate got picked up in favor of Doonesbury, that didn't happen, but somehow this letter writer equated them in his mind, and I remember he wrote, you know, basically, Doonesbury shines with the red-hot intensity of 1,000 suns, and Big Nate is a single candle. But you can't, you know.
The Post pickup was an important milestone for you, though, right?
It was great because the Washington Post still has the biggest comic section of any paper in the country. So, and I've been in there ever since. So it's great.
This one I don't know the answer to because I asked the editor who's in charge of the comics page at the Press Herald when Big Nate started, and he goes, I don't know.
Neither do I.
Yeah, neither do I.
2000, maybe.
Maybe. Well, we'll have to do the research. We're going to have to go back in the archives and follow that out. One thing that happened when you were working with the syndicate is they put you in touch with your childhood hero?
Yeah. So my childhood hero, Charles Schultz. So we were with the same syndicate. He was still alive at the time. He was still doing Peanuts. And my editor, Sarah, said to me, as they were sort of getting ready to launch me, she said, well, I don't want to, get your hopes up, but we show a lot of our new stuff, we show to Sparky to just ask him for feedback, see what he thinks. And so Sparky has looked at Big Nate, and he likes it. And sometimes when he likes something, he'll, you know, he may call you. So I'm thinking, you know, wow. I mean, imagine getting called by your childhood hero. So my wife and I were living in Brooklyn at the time, and I remember I was like taking a little nap on the couch in the living room. The phone rang, and my wife picked it up, and then she came into the room. She said, "Charles Schultz is on the phone." And it moved me. I mean, it was incredible. I can't tell you what, you know, I mean, it's sort of like the realization of all your boyhood dreams. And he was a sweet guy. And we only met in person once, but we talked on the phone, you know, a couple times a year maybe. And we talk about comics, we talk about hockey. He grew up in Minnesota, and he was a hockey fan. And then when he relocated to California, because he was Charles Schultz and he had, you know, money to burn, he built himself his own hockey rink. And one of my greatest regrets is, in my early days of syndication, he and I were on the phone, and we were talking about playing men's league hockey. And he said, you know, you got to come out here and skate with me. And I said, oh, that would be great, but I'm thinking, like, is he just sort of being nice? You know, is he just being polite? You know, it would have seemed sort of like bad form for me to say, when should I come? You know, I can be there Wednesday. So I did not sort of nail him down or anything like that. And besides, you know, I didn't have two nickels to rub together at that point in time. I couldn't have, on my own dime, flown out to California to play hockey with Charles Schultz. So it never happened. And so that's one of my regrets, that I never skated with Sparky.
Right. Shift gears a little bit here to talk about the job of a syndicated cartoonist. What's a workday like? How do you, I mean, you wake up in the morning, you have your orange juice?
Don't like orange juice that much, but so it's more complicated for me now than it was for like the first 18 years I did it, because now, in addition to doing the strip, I also write books for kids. So a day can look very different if I'm working on the strip versus if I'm working on a book. But if it's a strip day, so I have an office at home. That's one of the greatest things about my job. I get to work at home. It's a small office, but it has a couch in it. The couch is where I do all my thinking. And so it's a boring answer, but I just sit down and try to think up jokes. I try to think up, not so much jokes, but I try to think of funny situations and conversations. So I was just, a couple weeks ago, I was working on Halloween strips that are going to be upcoming at the end of October. And for the longest time, you know, over the years, I usually do Halloween strips, and I felt like, oh, you know, I'm running out of good costumes to put these kids in. But I came up with, so this year, Nate is the genie from Aladdin, and Teddy is Lil Nas X, and Francis is the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
You had to draw tests for each of these, right? Just to see how that was going to work out?
Yeah, do a little, you know, just draw them to make sure I can draw them. And then because they're trick-or-treating gags, a lot of the gags are about candy, which is another thing I could talk about for the entire hour, candy.
Candy, okay. Yeah. When you're working in your office, is it a quiet area or is it noisy? Do you try to shut off stimulation? Do you try to let it in? How does that work?
It's quiet when I'm thinking, and it's louder when I'm drawing.
Okay.
I can't think of things when there's something else going on.
And how does the strip take shape? You've got a big blank piece of paper with borders on it. And then you...
I have a wooden frame that my brother built for me because, like Sparky, my hero, Big Nate is always for identically sized panels. And I love that look. When I started the strip, basically, the syndicate didn't say to me, your strip has to be, 4 inches high, 14 inches wide, so that we can shrink it down, whatever. They just said, look at the comics page and just make sure your strip is the same dimensions as one of the strips that you find in the comics page. So I looked at all the comics in the newspaper, and just in terms of the dimensions of the panels, the one that I liked best was Blondie. Not the gags, just the size. I like the dimensions of the panels. So I replicated that, and then I asked my brother, will you build me a frame? Because he's a woodworker. I said, will you build me a frame? So he did. And so I have a wooden frame. I put it on a sheet of paper, and I trace the boxes. And then I draw ruled lines so that when I do my lettering, the lettering is neat and tidy. Because although I hated to have to learn this as I, sort of improved over my younger years, like neat handwriting is important in cartooning, and so I had to learn how to write neatly.
Would Nate agree with that?
Nate's handwriting is not bad. Nate draws his own comics,
yeah.
Of course, and his handwriting is not bad. It's better than mine was at his age.
So,
his jokes are better than mine were when I was in 6th grade.
So you've got the words and the balloons, and then you start drawing from there?
So I have, I'm old school, so I still sketch things out with what's called a non-photo blue pencil. It's an animator's tool, and it's called that because it doesn't show up when you scan or photocopy. The blue pencil doesn't. So I sketch everything out in the blue pencil, and then I go over it in pen. And although when I was younger, I learned how to draw with a fountain pen and different size nibs, I ended up deciding that disposable pens work best for me. So I just use disposable pens, cheesy disposable pens, and when they start going dry, I throw them away. And then when they're done, the only part of what I do now that's high tech is, I used to send my originals in to the syndicate. I would deliver them myself when we were living in Brooklyn, and then I would go to FedEx when we moved to Maine, and then a certain point, 10 or 12 years ago, they called me up and they said, you're the only one of our cartoonists that's still sending in your originals, and we don't want the liability anymore of having your original artwork here, so scan it and send it. And then I had to confront my technophobia because I'm a Luddite.
It's a good thing you never lost any of those shipments.
Yeah. No, well, one time I sent a month of strips, and they never got them.
Oh.
And they were missing for maybe 2 weeks, and they found them on a dock in New Jersey somewhere. And they survived.
Well, phew. I want to talk about some of the characters. Just jump into the strip itself.
Yeah.
Are they based on real people?
There are only 2 characters that are really based on actual individuals. One is Francis. He is based, so his name is Francis Pope, and he's based on a kid that I taught at Xavier High School named Francis Pope, who was one of the worst art students I've ever had, but a hilarious kid, and very unique looking. He had brown hair, but even at age 15 or 16, he had like a shock of gray hair. So he stood out, and I just, as a teacher, I know you're not supposed to say this. He was my favorite. My favorite kid, just like cracked me up all the time. And so when I gave Nate a sidekick, I named him Francis Pope.
Nice.
And then the other character that's based on a real individual is Spitzy, the dog.
Okay.
Yeah, my best friend growing up, his family had a dog whose name wasn't Spitzy, it was Max, but it always had a cone to keep it from like chewing its own paws.
Was he at least part poodle?
I don't know what he was just a mutt, but just a complete failure as a dog.
Well, we have these here, so we might as well make use of them. We start, of course, with Nate.
Yeah.
So he's not based on, I mean...
Well, you know, as I said, he's named after my brother. My brother's name is not Nate, it's Jonathan. But when I was about 9 years old, I suddenly realized, I had this epiphany that if you took the first 2 letters off of the name Jonathan, you were left with the name Nathan. So I went to my brother, I said, I'm going to start calling you Nathan. And he said, no, you're not. What are you talking about? But I persisted. I did. I called him Nathan for like a day, and then I shortened it to Nate. And so it's one of those family nicknames where I call him Nate, and nobody else calls him Nate. So that's why I named the character Nate, because my brother's one of my favorite people. So
he spends a lot of time in detention.
He does. Yeah.
He's like the king of detention.
He is. Right. But I think it's pretty clear if you read the strip. He's not a troublemaker. He's not a bad kid. He's not needlessly cruel. He's not malicious. He's just one of those people that, you know, bad things happen to, which is pretty much the basis for all humor.
Right.
Because, you know, again, I invoke the name of Charles Schulz. He was asked so many times in his life, you know, why can't you ever let Charlie Brown kick the football? Why can't you ever let Charlie Brown, you know, have a date with the little red-haired girl or whatever? And his answer, which was so true, was because losing is funnier than winning. And it is so true. No one would read Big Nate if he was getting straight A's and never got sent to detention and got along well with all his teachers. I mean, that strip would last a week.
But he does have his triumphs.
Yeah, because it's already been done to perfection to have a character who never wins. That's Charlie Brown. And I wasn't going to try to compete with Charlie Brown. And I think it's important to give him his triumphs. So he has his triumphs, but he has his tragedies as well.
All right. Well, I was worried about asking this question, but then I read one of the characters in the strip say something about Nate's weird hair.
Yeah.
What is...
I have no idea. So, so when I was pitching Big Nate, when it was still called Neighborhood Comics, Nate was at one time sort of pudgy and had a haircut sort of like, if you know the characters, there's a character in the strip called Artur, and he has sort of like this mushroom cap haircut where it's like long on the top and like buzzed on the sides. And so Nate had hair that looked sort of like that. And when I sent it in, some of the feedback I got from my editor was, you know, Nate looks like sort of like a 40-year-old man. Like, and I said, that's not the look I'm going for. So I just said, I'll just make his hair more kind of eccentric looking. But I had sort of committed to this. I liked the way it looked that he sort of had no hair on the sides. So he's bald on the sides. I don't really know why. And then he has these just eruptions of hair coming out of the top of his head. And I get probably more questions about his hair when I go to schools than anything, because kids will say, like, they'll ask what's up with his hair. They'll ask, why does Nate have dreadlocks?
That was, yeah, so it's not dreadlocks. It's just crazy hair.
It's just crazy hair, yeah. And I just call, you know, it's spiky, I guess.
Yeah. That works. So we're just going to go through a few of the characters and that I picked out. Of course, Francis you already talked about.
Yes, Francis.
He's a smart guy.
He's smart, and he was sort of, so he was one of the, when I started the strip, there were only 6 characters. Nate, Francis, Nate's dad, Nate's sister, Mrs. Godfrey, and Mr. Rosa, the art teacher. And so Francis, I felt like, had to be sort of a countermeasure to Nate, almost like like I always thought in the back of my mind, sort of like Jiminy Cricket, like he was Nate's conscience in a way. He was, you know, Nate has these harebrained schemes, and Francis usually is skeptical about the schemes, and he's smarter than Nate in many ways, but maybe not as creative a thinker.
All right, next, I only picked 6, so I won't be comprehensive. Gina.
Gina, yeah. So Gina I brought in just to sort of provide a foil for Nate. And there is I cannot accept this, but there is like a devoted sort of fan base out there that is convinced that Nate and Gina are secretly in love.
I can see this. I completely can.
And I go to schools, you know, and kids say this, like, when are Gina and Nate going to get together? I'm like, what are you talking about? Never. Never. It will not happen. I take this solemn pledge. It's not going to happen.
All right. Next in line, we have, I had to pick Chad.
Chad.
For obvious reasons.
I love Chad. So he's like my favorite character to draw. He is so easy to draw. His head is like a block. His body is a circle. He always looks happy. He's an innocent. And I don't remember sort of what series of gags it was that sort of led me to introduce Chad, but I needed a character who was sort of a, you know, just like the most steadfast, loyal, sort of cheery, like little sidekick. And so I just invented Chad.
I support Chad.
I've never met a Chad I didn't like Chad.
So Dee Dee is kind of new.
Dee Dee's awesome. So Dee Dee, here's my story about Dee Dee. So I had started writing these Big Nate novels. I started that in 2010, and after I had written, I guess, 3 of them, maybe 2 or 3 of them, I was on a book tour, and I was in St. Louis, and I was in a bookstore. And I did a little easel talk, and then there was a question and answer period, and I called on a girl. She was probably about 9 years old, and her question was, why are all the females in your books so annoying? And it was a good question, because I said, here's why. I said, because the books are told from Nate's perspective. Nate is a boy, and he's immature. And so he tends to see the girls and or women in his life at 2 extremes. They are either like objects of a crush, like Jenny, the girl that he, you know, was in love with for years and years and years, or they're these monsters like Mrs. Godfrey or Gina or his sister Ellen. And I thought about this question this girl had asked, like, what is preventing me from creating a character who is a girl, who is neither of those extremes? What if she's just in the middle? What if she's just a friend to Nate? So for the 4th book that I wrote, which was called Big Nate Goes for Broke, I created this character, Dee Dee. But I thought it would be unrealistic if she and Nate were just like best friends right away. So in true Nate fashion, he finds her annoying at first. She's a drama queen, and he doesn't quite know what to make of her, but by the end of the book, she has proven herself to be true blue. And he has grown to understand that what a friend she is. And she sort of is like the hero of the book in many ways. And so that's why I created Dee Dee.
And she made the leap from the book to the comics.
Yeah, then I brought her into the strip.
All right. Do I have 1 more or 2 more? I guess only 1 more. Mrs. Godfrey.
Yeah.
Is it wrong that I have compassion for this poor woman?
Well, so I did have just a horrible social studies teacher when I was in middle school. And I would never base a character who is so unappealing in so many ways on a specific person. I think that would be cruel. But you know, when you have a teacher that you really don't like, I mean, that just sticks with you. That sticks with you. And I mean, and the ironic thing is, I mean, I love history. I love history. But she somehow found a way to make history just the absolute worst. So, and it's easier to write gags, you know, when Nate struggles in school, it's much easier to write gags about history stuff that seems sort of boring or overwhelming than it would be to write about math. Like math, it's hard to write good math gags. So it's a lot easier to write good social studies gags.
Well, I've gotten the high side, and I only have one more question left, and I've got like half a deck of cards.
Look at that.
Here, so, sorry. We're going to have to go just a tiny bit over. Would Mrs. Godfrey approve of comics?
I would say no, but, you know, in one of the books, she sort of is won over by these comics that Nate draws about Ben Franklin. So, so she may have a little bit of comics lover in her.
The follow-up is, you know, when you and I are of a similar age, I'm a little bit older than you are, teachers and librarians and educators weren't all that down with me reading comics.
No, but one of my heroes when I was a kid was my high school Latin teacher, Frank Milliken. And I only had him for 2 years, and then he retired. And when he died a couple of years ago, I read, you know, how old he was when he died, and then I did the math, how old he was when he retired, and I realized when he retired, you know, I thought he was like 72. He's 55, the age I am now. So anyway, he was my hero because I would come into his class, and every day I would draw a little cartoon on his blackboard. And he never erased it. So even if he like, you know, had to use like the whole blackboard, he would like make sure that like he would just write smaller or do whatever he had to do to not erase my cartoon. So yeah, he was the greatest.
But teachers and librarians now, they're encouraging kids to engage with comics.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, my most horrifying like evil teacher story about comics was I had an algebra teacher in high school, and her name was Mrs. Hill, and she was so dead affect. Her expression never changed, to the point where like we joked amongst ourselves, the students, that she was actually like she was an android, she was a robot. So I drew a comic about that. And so I was working on it in class, and then my pencil broke. So I had to get up and sharpen my pencil, and of course I wasn't just going to leave this comic like out on the desk, so I put it under my notebook. And then I went over to the pencil sharpener, I'm grinding away. And I look over, and she's standing by my desk. And she lifts up my notebook, and she pulls out the comic that I drew about her. It's clearly about her. There was no mistaking. So I just kept sharpening my pencil. I'm like, I'm just going to sharpen this till it's a nub, a pile of shavings. I'm not going back over there. And she read it. It took her, you know, probably 30 seconds. She read it, and then she looked back up at me, and then she took it, and she just tore it.
Oh.
Yeah, she just ripped it up. So I can't really blame the woman. It was not flattering, the comics that I drew of her. But yeah, she was more typical than was my Latin teacher, because, you know, the teachers did not want you drawing comics on class time.
Sad. Well, I'm out of time, so we're going to have to open it up to the floor for questions.
Yes.
Molly has the microphone, so we're going to wait until people get the microphone before we start listening to their questions. So I will ask people, I guess, to raise their hands, and Molly will pick somebody.
Right here.
She's all set.
So I love Big Nate. And,
Hi, David.
And I find him very fresh and usually very funny. And I don't understand. I walk by your house at night and I see the light on late at night. But I wonder how. I don't do that because I'm stalking you. But I don't understand how you can keep doing it day after day. and coming up with fresh ideas. And do you do them? Do you do many in one day? Do you do them one a day? Where do you get it from?
So, well, Sparky said that like the art of doing a comic strip is basically telling the same joke over and over again, you know, every day without repeating yourself. And I think that sums it up. I mean, the thing about comics that is different from maybe other forms of entertainment is that part of a daily comic strip is that it does repeat itself. You know, you do keep returning to different themes. So, you know, I look forward every year to doing some Halloween strips, or, you know, in the spring, I'm going to do some baseball strips, you know, and in the fall, I'm going to do some pictures where the school picture guy comes in to take school pictures, you know. So I would like to think that, you know, I'm still writing as well as I ever have, but I've been doing it, you know, for almost 30 years. Burke Breathed, the guy who did Bloom County, his theory was, after 10 years, you're toast, and there are no more fresh ideas. But then he came back a couple of years ago, and he now is doing fresh Bloom Counties again. So, I mean, what I just try to do is focus on what's memorable and funny about the characters that I have, because I think a trap that I don't want to get into is to try to keep the strip fresh by just continually adding new characters. I don't think that's, I was advised against that early on, and I think that was good advice. So, so I still crack myself up. I mean, I wouldn't draw them if they didn't get a laugh out of me, and if they don't pass that test, then I don't draw them. And if I get to the point where I don't think the strip is fresh, then I'll stop.
All right, we've got some more questions right over here.
Yep. Go ahead.
Will there be any more Big Nate novels?
I'm not planning any new Big Nate novels. So I did 8, and the publisher would have liked me to do more, but when I was working on the 7th one and the 8th one, I started to get worried about repeating myself. And everybody has had that experience of watching a TV show or reading a book series and thinking, you know, I wish this had ended a little earlier. You know, why did they go on to season 10 and 11? They should have stopped after season 8, you know. And so I was happy with the 8 Big Nate novels, and I thought that was a good way to stop. Now, if 5 years from now, if I had a great idea for another Big Nate novel, I would write it. But for right now, I'm not thinking along those lines.
But you are still doing Max and the Midnights.
Yes, I'm working on Max and the Midnights book 2 right now. Thank you, Chad. Nice plug. Nice plug. You're good at your job, Chad.
Thank you.
Will you make more Big Nate, like, comic books?
Yeah, those are coming out all the time, because you know what those are? Those are collections of comic strips that have already been in the newspaper. So a book came out just last week called Big Nate Hug It Out. And it's a collection of strips that were in the newspaper back in like 2015. So they come out with 2 of those a year. And so as long as I'm continuing to do comics for the newspaper, they'll keep printing those books.
So, you have different stories about how things ended up. Like, for an example, how Art and Jenny fell in love. Like that in the original novels. In the novels, you tried to encourage that, like, that happened in the hallway and Nate passed out on the floor. And but no, that was not the novels. That was the comics. But then in the novels, you said that like it happened at the dance. Like, which one do you try to encourage?
You're pointing out my inconsistencies. There are many. There are many. It would be embarrassing. It would be embarrassing for me to if I were to concoct a list of all the mistakes I've made and all the inconsistencies, it would be long. It would be a big list. Sometimes it's about drawing characters inconsistently, like when I introduced the character of the Principal Nichols, and so I was drawing him like a year later after I had introduced him, and I realized I was drawing his ears completely differently than the way I had drawn them when I first introduced him. So that stuff happens all the time. And then, yeah, I've had to, so here's a classic example. Gina, the character Gina. So at a certain point, there was a storyline in the comic strip where I had to give some of the characters last names. And I had never really thought of last names for some of the characters. So I gave Gina the name Toms, the last name Toms, T-O-M-S. And then literally just a few months later, I completely forgot I had done that, and I gave it a last name Hempel. So then when I realized I had done this, I just created a hyphenated name. So her name is Gina Hempel Toms. So thank you. Thank you. You got to keep me honest there.
I think that Gina will probably have no boyfriends ever because she's so annoying. Well, I don't think she is, but also I'm asking, will she?
That was hilarious. I have no idea. So the thing about Big Nate is that the strip is probably more main character focused, or as main character focused as any strip that's out there. So even though there are a lot of characters, Nate is in virtually every strip. So I think it's unlikely that I would explore like a storyline involving Gina and her love life, because I always stay close to Nate. But I have done storylines where, there was a storyline where Nate wanted to, it was a Valentine's thing, and Nate wanted to give a Valentine's cookie, to this girl that he liked, whose name was Tina. And so, they were being sold by some club in the school, and so he ordered a cookie that was going to say something like, It
said, "Be mine, cutie," I think.
He wanted to say, "Be mine, Tina," but instead it said, "Be mine, Gina." And these are the sorts of things that fuel these conspiracy Nate and Gina theories. But I am guilty. I encouraged this because, so Nate at first, of course, assumes this was the fault of the person who made the cookie. Like, in his order form, he clearly wrote, "Be mine, Tina," and then he sees his order form and he actually wrote, "Be mine, Gina."
That seems like a clue.
Yeah. But it's still not going to happen.
How long does it usually take for you to write a Big Nate book?
Like a novel?
Yeah.
So it would take me, usually it would take me about 10 months. About 5 months to write the story, and 5 more months to do all the drawings. So I work slowly, especially in the drawing part, because I've been having a lot of conversations lately about how much more quickly you can work nowadays if you work digitally. If instead of drawing on paper, you draw on a digital tablet. But I still do it all old school. And I still do all my own lettering. A lot of cartoonists create their own digital font, you know, an alphabet of their own. And then, so instead of doing the hand lettering, they'll just type it and just drop it into a speech bubble. And the reason that I don't really care for that working model is that it sort of takes away the chance for any happy accidents to happen.
Expression
when you're drawing, right,
yeah.
Right. Because if I were just cutting and pasting the same drawing of Nate over and over again, then I wouldn't have any happy accidents, you know, and it would be a lot less interesting to look at. So.
I want to thank you and all the other comic artists for, forgive me for saying this, Chad, providing something intelligent to see in the newspaper every day. And secondly, Nate always has trouble with the names of his baseball team.
He does.
Currently it's the Cupcakes, and I'm sure it will transform into something equally embarrassing next year maybe. Is he aware that the Montgomery, Alabama Southern League team is called the Montgomery Biscuits?
He is not. But I, as a biscuit lover, I'm in favor of anything called a biscuit. It's my favorite breakfast.
Okay. It would be interesting to see how he would react to that information.
Yeah, well, so his baseball team name has changed many times, and I think I just, you know, it's the sort of thing where, you know, you feel self-conscious when all your friends are playing on teams called, you know, like the Eagles and you know, the Yankees and whatever, and your team is called like Joe's Pizza. So I think that's how it started. It was called Joe's Pizza, and then I had a series of gags where every year, like Joe's Pizza would go out of business to be replaced by like Joe's Fried Chicken, to be replaced by Joe's Falafel, to be replaced by whatever. Yeah, so now they're in a pastry theme. So they were called the Cream Puffs for a while, and now they've been the Cupcakes for at least a couple of seasons.
All right, so we have just 5 minutes left for questions, so let's try to get through as many as we can.
I have 2 questions.
What?
Okay. What is Nate's dad handing out for Halloween this year?
I didn't do any gags about that this year. Okay. All the gags I did about Halloween this year are about Nate and his friends going around to other houses. So I left Dad out of the storyline altogether this year. But good question.
What's coming next in the next comics for Spissy and Pickles?
So Spitsy is the dysfunctional dog that lives next door to Nate, and Pickles is Francis's cat, and they're in love. And to Nate's just astonishment and just disbelief. So because I write these things like a couple months in advance, I can never quite remember like what's been in the paper and what hasn't. So didn't they recently go off on, like, they thought they were going to go off on a honeymoon, right? Right. Yeah. So did they elope or did they not? As it turned out, they didn't. So, so I'm in the first week of November now in terms of the strips I've done, and I have not yet returned to the ongoing Spitsy and Pickles theme. So we'll just have to see. I'm not sure. To be continued.
What is your favorite character in general?
Nate. He's the star. So he's fun to draw. He is interesting. Now, there are other characters that are fun to draw. I mentioned Chad. I love Chad. I mean, from a personality standpoint, Chad is, everyone loves Chad. But to draw, one of my favorite characters is Coach John, who is this big, round sort of drill sergeant of a gym teacher. He's a blast to draw because he's always got really extreme expressions on his face. So Nate is my favorite character just overall, but there are plenty of other characters I like to draw who are my favorites to draw. I love to draw Spitzy too.
Right back here.
Just a few words about country music. Anything you want to say?
Anything I want to say?
Anything you want to say. As long as you talk about Hank.
I think it's important to have hobbies, and country music is one of my hobbies. And so, you know, I'm one of those extraordinarily fortunate people that something that I really love to do is my job, is my profession. But having said that, I think it's important to have boundaries set up to keep my work life separate from the rest of my life, so that when I'm out riding my bike or something like that, I'm not thinking about Big Nate at all. I never think about the strip when I'm doing something else. And so when I'm at WMPG, the greatest community radio station in the world, so when I am there, I'm thinking only about country music. And like with comics, I became a country music fan as a child, not because my parents weren't comics people, so I sort of discovered comics on my own. And my parents definitely weren't country music people, but I discovered country music by watching Hee Haw. How else was someone in New England going to learn about country music? Hee Haw was the only game in town.
Buck Owens could play really well.
Yeah, and so, well, for me, it wasn't Buck Owens, it was Conway Twitty.
Oh, okay.
So I turned on Hee Haw. Conway Twitty was singing a song called Linda on My Mind. And I said, what is this? Who is this? And then soon after that, I heard my first George Jones song. That was a big moment for me. And then, so growing up in New Hampshire, we were in between like Boston and Maine, and so we got the Boston TV stations, but we also got WMTW TV, Channel 8, Poland Springs, Maine. And they were always running K-Tel commercials for Hank Williams records back then. So what did I know from Hank Williams? But I would see these K-Tel things, and they would play a few snippets of some Hank songs, and I was just intrigued. But I did not want to go public with my country music love, because that would have outed me as just like a complete retro nerd at my high school, because everyone was listening to Lynyrd Skynyrd, Molly Hatchet. They were listening to like Southern rock. That was big in the late 70s. And I was, meanwhile, I had like snuck out and bought my first George Jones record. So yeah, I love country music. It's my hobby. I would never call myself, you know, an expert on it. I'm just an enthusiast.
Monday mornings, right?
Monday mornings, 8:30 to 10:30.
All right, we're going to get some quick questions here, 3 more, and then it's 8:15. Lincoln's going to sign some books, because I know, so you guys can ask your questions when you get up there. So just a few more.
What's your favorite book to write?
You mean, what is my favorite book that I've written? Yeah. So it's the 4th book in the Big Nate novel series. It's called Big Nate Goes for Broke. So that's the book where I introduced Dee Dee, and it's the only book of the 8 that happens in the wintertime. And it was just, from a drawing standpoint, it was fun to make drawings of snowball fights. You know, there's a snow sculpture contest at the end of the book. And I'm a fan of winter. I mean, winter has always been like an incredibly positive time for me. I loved winter as a kid, and I still love winter. So that's my favorite.
Those kids from Jefferson are so mean.
They are. They are.
What inspired you to make the jump from Big Nate to Max and the Midnights?
That's a good question. I like telling stories, And for the reasons I explained earlier, I felt like I had come to the end of the Big Nate novels, but I didn't want to just stop writing books for kids because I found out that that's something that I really enjoyed doing. So I had some ideas kicking around that I had pitched years earlier as ideas for TV shows, for cartoons on like Cartoon Network or Nickelodeon. And one of them was a story that I called King Conrad. And it was a Sword in the Stone spoof. And so I pulled that out of my desk and I reread it. And I really liked the medieval part of it, you know, the fact that it was Middle Ages. And I wanted to tell an adventure story, but I still wanted it to be funny. So I said, I'm gonna reimagine this, and I'm gonna, instead of making it about King Conrad, I'm gonna make it around this different character named Max. And so that's why I did it. And I thought it was just gonna be a one-off, but then I liked it, and I decided I would write 2 more. So I'm working on the second one, and then I'm going to do a third one. And then I'll figure out what I'm going to do after that.
All right, last question.
So one of the big ways that you got to where you were today is having a positive mindset. But throughout your career, was there any idea or thought that kind of set you back and thought maybe this wasn't for you?
No, I never thought it wasn't for me, but I did have, probably my biggest disappointment was I was in graduate school, and I submitted a comic strip idea called Good Enough, G-O-O-D-E, Enough. Good was the last name of the main character. His name was Alvin Good. And he was a sort of aimless college graduate who hadn't really found any traction in what he was doing, and so he has to move back home with his parents. And so I submitted that to all the major syndicates, and I got back a letter from Lee Salem, who was the comics editor at Universal Press Syndicate. And he said, I want to see more. And that was the first time that any editor had ever asked to see more. And I was over the moon, but I was also nervous, you know, and convinced that, boy, I better get him some stuff right away. Otherwise, this opportunity might just dry up and blow away. So the way you submit stuff, or the way you did it back then, was they wanted to see 4 weeks worth of material. So in about like 8 days, I cranked out 4 weeks worth of stuff just to get it to him. And I sent it in, and then when I did hear back from him the second time, it was just a flat no. It was like, it was basically just a tiny step up from a form letter. And I thought, wow, like I thought maybe this was my chance, and I blew it. Like I rushed myself, and I tried to. So that set me back, but I wouldn't say that I always knew I was going to get syndicated, because I didn't. But I always knew I was going to draw comics, whether they were going to be published or not. Like I drew comics my whole life for my friends and my family before anything ever got published. And I would have just kept doing that even if I hadn't got anything published. So that's my mindset. Good question.
All right, so I guess we're done. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Chad.